Hi there, this is John Carswell bringing you a message from Cadzel Parish Church on this Palm Sunday. So raise your hands here. How many of you have lost track of time, forgetting what day it is this week? During this period of isolation, time has sort of slipped into some vague categories for me. I was having a conversation with my children last night, and I said, how long have we been in this isolation? It's been 2 weeks, right? And they shook their head and said, no, Dad, it's only been 1 week. And I thought to myself, my goodness, it feels like we've been doing this for a month. What makes it so difficult is that all the usual markers for time that we use, the day that we go bowling, or the day that we meet our friends for coffee, or the day we go to school, or the day we worship, all of those time markers have been erased. And one day just seems to drift into the other without any sense that this is Monday and this is Tuesday, this is Saturday, and this is Sunday. Now, what makes this time particularly difficult is that, one, we don't have those usual markers. But what makes it particularly challenging is that there's no end time to this crisis. There is no ending time that we can discern. We can't say, right, just 38 more days to go, because we could be in isolation for an extended period of time. You might ask yourself, well, how long is a piece of string? As I think about this crisis, I think there's two ways of thinking about time. There's one which is the fast current. The fast current is indicated by such things like the fast construction of the Nightingale Hospital in London, where they converted a convention center and now have literally the largest hospital in the world with 4,000 beds. It reminds me of the story of a couple months ago where the Chinese managed to build hospitals in a matter of days rather than in a matter of months. There is an immediacy to this crisis that is so demanding. We need ventilators, we need doctors, we need hospital space. But there's also a slow current. And that's the one that I think is more interesting, and the one that will be studied by sociologists, by scientists, by environmentalists for decades to come. Now, I've heard some of the old folks that I know talk about the war years, and there's been a lot of comparisons between the crisis that we're going through now and the war years from back in the late 30s and 40s. And the difference, and I think it's a very significant difference between what's happening now and what's happening then, is that then people went through the crisis together. They were able to gather, they were able to see their neighbors, they were able to collectively ensure that everyone had what they needed. But this thing is social isolation, which is a completely different phenomenon. And it's uncharted territory. Nobody knows, for instance, how long a society can hold together when there's no community. We don't know how many people will simply die of loneliness during this time period. The whole definition of close talker is now irrelevant. It used to be a close talker was someone who got in your face. And now a close talker is someone who gets in your space, that 2-meter radius that we like to keep. And people get pretty sharp if you step in too close. And with good reason, it's dangerous to do so. So we're in a real season of change. Now, we don't usually think of time as measured in seasons. Of course, we know about spring and summer and autumn and winter and things, but that kind of thinking about time doesn't make sense to us so much. We don't look at the calendar and say, bang, now is the beginning of spring, or now is the beginning of summer. We might notice the signs of the spring, which we're seeing right now with the flowers popping up and the trees beginning to bud. But we don't have a date on a calendar so much as we have a sense that the season is moving and changing. Another way of thinking about it is how do you measure the seasons of your life? How do you measure the honeymoon years of your marriage, for example? Or how do you measure your parenting years? Or how do you set bounds on a season of grief and mourning? I mean, you might think that, well, there's a birth date and there's a wedding date and the day of someone's death. But those periods wax and wane. The honeymoon years come and go. And I know elderly couples who are just as happy as they were on the day of their marriage. And with grief, there's no right time or there's no wrong time for the length of your grief. We think of seasons, but usually we measure time and think about time on a linear scale. In other words, we think of things as moving logically from one thing to the next. 6 a.m. is earlier than noon, but also 6 a.m. is later than 3 a.m. Someone who's 20 is on an earlier portion of the time scale than someone who is 50. And in between those points in that linear scale, we break it up into smaller and smaller units. We talk about months, and we talk about days, and we talk about hours and minutes. And when we do that, when we break up time into smaller pieces, it gives us a greater sense of meaning and a greater sense of value. Think about the way that we use time in our language. We talk about spending time as if it were an asset, and we place a lot of value on practices that we invest a lot of time in. For example, it takes a long time to learn how to play piano, and the more time that's invested in that art form, the more valuable that becomes. Same is true of any craft, learning a language or learning how to dance or learning how to play tennis. Now, similarly, we talk about wasting time, that we slept in and lost all this time, or that we were tied up, we were ill and lost a bunch of time, as if somehow some measure of value has been lost to us because of this waste of time. And that's all one way of thinking about it, as if we only have so much of it and that we have to make the most of it. And that can be very stressful during this time of social isolation because of the reasons I talked about earlier. If we can get very anxious about the fact that we're wasting time or losing time because those hours and minutes can't be spent, or rather marked, in the same way that they have historically been in our lives. Now, the thing to know about God is that God does not think of time as being linear. God sees time as a whole, as one thing. Now, in the Reformation in the 16th century, Martin Luther, a great reformer, came up with a phrase called simul justus et peccator, which means simultaneously justified and sinner. Now, this is a fascinating phrase, and it suggests that God thinks about time in a different way. Because how can we be simultaneously a sinner and simultaneously justified? It doesn't fit with our ordinary measures of time. Luther's way of thinking about things is so very helpful, and particularly right now, that we are simultaneously sinners and justified. And what that means is that God doesn't see time as linear. God sees it as a seasonal thing. And God sees us literally simultaneously as broken people who are lost, but also as whole people who have been found. Now, the trouble with thinking of time on a linear basis is that it creates a lot of anxiety in our hearts because, as I said, it feels like we're wasting time. And that's because we tend to focus too much on that fast current. But I want to encourage us to think about that slow current. And that slow current is about the transforming work that God is doing in our society during this time period. I was talking to a friend yesterday, and he says, John, there's all kinds of things that can be studied right now and will be studied for decades, scientists and social studies. And he pointed out that environmentalists are also going to be looking at this time as a fascinating period. You can think of, what if all the trains and planes and cars stopped for a day or a week? What would that do to the environment? But this is a season where all those things have stopped. You can't hear the planes overhead. There's a greatly reduced amount of traffic. And how is that going to affect the environment? They say that in places like Wuhan and in Los Angeles that suddenly the skies are clearing. And how is that season of transformation affecting the environment? Now, when Jesus came into Jerusalem riding on a donkey, it was the fulfillment of an ancient prophecy in which the prophet said, "Behold, your king comes to you lowly and riding on a donkey." And as Jesus did so, there was an immediacy to that event, that he knew that literally within a matter of days, he would be tried and crucified. And he had that sense of perhaps anxiety or that sense of impending agony that was coming his way. But at the same time, because he wasn't thinking of time just as a linear function, he was thinking of time as a whole. He could anticipate his crucifixion, but also his resurrection. He could think of the immediacy of the sin of the voices of the people who would be soon calling for his crucifixion, but he could also see their salvation. He saw them as simul justus et peccator, sinners and righteous all at the same time. He could hear the voice of the prophet saying, many hundreds of years earlier, "Behold, your king comes to you riding on a donkey." He could sense that, he could hear that voice, but he could also sense in the immediacy of his doing the act that these things were one and the same. He was fulfilling a prophecy, but he could also hear it being spoken at the same time. And God looks at us in the same way. God can see the day of our first breath, and he can see the day of our last breath. He sees us in our infancy and in our dotage. He can see all the days that were numbered for us before one of them came to be. And God can know us also in eternity, as his plan is revealed not on a linear basis, not as a one thing happens after the other, but in its totality. God can see us before the day that we were born, and God can see us made fit for eternity. Friends, it's very difficult during this time, and many of us have a sense of anxiety because of that fast current. But I want to encourage you to think about the slow current and ponder, what is God doing in the long term? And just as God moves the seasons from one to the next with 1,000 almost indiscernible indicators, God's doing the same thing in us individually, but also, and I think more importantly, God is doing this as a society. God is transforming the way that we think of ourselves and the way we think about others. So I want to try an experiment today, right? If you're with me, I want you to try to remove some of the markers of time in your household. Think about, how many clocks do you have in your house? And you might be surprised at how many. Perhaps you've got a clock by your bedside, or a clock in the microwave, or a clock hanging on the wall, or a grandfather clock. Most all of us have, well, if you're watching this video, then you certainly have a little clock in the corner of your computer screen or on your smartphone. You can count up 8 or 9 or 10 or a dozen or even more clocks in your life. And I want you to try an experiment with me today. I'd like you to begin turning those off, or at least turning them away from being visible. One at a time. You don't have to do it all at once, because that in itself would drive us nuts. But if you can turn off one at a time, and then the next day turn another clock to the wall, and maybe let that grandfather clock run down. Try to extricate yourself from the tyranny of time. Look at this period of isolation as a season rather than as a number of days and hours. Think of it as an investment in yourself and a time to draw closer to God, and see yourself as God does, which is whole and holy and beloved. And may God bless you in the doing of it. Thanks for tuning in today. It's been great to have you with me. Pay attention. I'll be doing some daily devotions this week during Holy Week. I'll be serving a communion service on Thursday night and, of course, Easter Sunday. I'd also love to hear from you. So if you got questions or comments, or if you got some ideas about what we could talk about on this channel, just let me know in the comment section below. Be sure to subscribe, take your notification bell, and give me a like if you enjoyed what you heard today. And I'll see you next time. Thanks for coming.